Thank you everyone for being here for day 2 of Human Rights Activism and Awareness Week. I'm Jeff Bachman, faculty in SIS and Director of the Ethics, Peace and Global Affairs Program, along with Evan Berry in Philosophy and Religion. I definitely want to thank Marjorie, who I'll introduce momentarily, for being here. Also Lauren and Alyssa for all their hard work in helping make this happen, and of course all of you for being here. Just a few quick plugs. The rest of the week we do have tomorrow Whistleblowers and Press Freedoms with Chris Hedges. That'll be an MGC from 1:30 to 3:30. Thursday we will be talking about drones with Colonel Ann Wright, a former member of the military, an outspoken critic of the Iraq War as well as the use of drones, and Ali McCracken from Code Pink. We will also have Chris Woods formerly of the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, which has done tremendous investigations into covert operations, including drone strikes in Somalia, Pakistan, and Yemen. And then Friday we will have a 2-part event on the Israeli-Palestinian situation. The first part will be a screening of a film called Voices Across the Divide. The director, Alice Rothschild, will be here with us for the screening and then for a Q&A after. She was raised a Zionist, and after hearing narratives from Palestinians has changed her position on the situation. And then we'll also have Dr. Nidal Slimani, who works on diaspora and refugee rights for Palestinians. He will be joining us after to talk about human rights in the Palestinian territories from a Palestinian perspective. A couple other quick plugs you have on your seat. Drones and Targeted Killing. Maybe Marjorie will tell us a little bit more about that, but it's a book that she's editing that is due out in the next month or so, is that right?
Next month.
Next month. If any of you are interested, I also have handouts for the 15th Annual Human Rights Film Series. It begins next Wednesday, or maybe 2 Wednesdays, October 1st. I'm assuming that is a Wednesday, maybe it's not. But on October 1st is the first screening. It's called E-Team. And the Week Investigative Squad exposes human rights around the world. I believe it's a Human Rights Watch film. 15 to Life, Kenneth's story, should a teen serve life sentences intended for dangerous criminals? The Supreme Price, one woman's life traces the Nigerian pro-democracy movement. And then finally, The Hand That Feeds, workers' battle for rights under threat of deportation from the United States. So after the event, feel free to grab one of these if you want to have the information for the film series. And then finally, also on your chairs, there is a new student/faculty/staff, group that's going to be launched, U.S. Foreign Policy Activist Cooperative. And our first meeting will be on October 2nd. It's to see if there's interest in having students who maybe have been looking for a way to engage and be active around U.S. foreign policy and human rights. This co-op would be, one means to be active and engaged with that. And so, if you are interested, it's also in the Founders Room Thursday, October 2nd from 11:30 to 1. So the last thing before I introduce Marjorie is, I didn't write any prepared remarks, but I think it's apt that we are having this event today, considering I woke up and went to the gym to find pictures all over the TV screens of bombing Syria. With the bombs dropping in Syria, obviously Iraq as well. If you throw in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, and perhaps other countries, the United States is currently bombing at least 6, if not more, countries. And this, of course, is 2 days after the International Day of Peace. And we were told that on top of attacking ISIS in Syria, there's another group that's an Al-Qaeda type affiliate that allegedly was imminently planning an attack against the United States. In my class yesterday, we had talked about how the use of the term imminent, or maybe I would argue the abuse of the term imminent, is used to justify what is argued to be a constant state of emergency, and therefore the right of the United States to violate human rights, not only its own people, but also the people outside the United States. And so, I think that brings us to our topic and to Marjorie. So, Marjorie Cohn is a professor at Thomas Jefferson School of Law in San Diego, past president of the National Lawyers Guild, and a longtime criminal defense attorney. She's Deputy Secretary General of the International Association of Democratic Lawyers, U.S. Representative to the Executive Council of the American Association of Jurists, a member of the Board of Governors of the Society of American Law Teachers, and Board of Directors of the U.S. Human Rights Network. Her latest book, or soon not to be her latest book, The United States in Torture, Interrogation, Incarceration, and Abuse, is available, and of course, she has this upcoming book on drones. So let's give Marjorie a welcome, and you can do it from your seat.
Oh, okay, great. Okay, well, I'm delighted to be here at AU as part of your Human Rights Week. I used to bring a team, I think every year for 10 years, to the law school's Inter-American Human Rights Moot Court competition. So it's nice to be back at AU. And thank you, Professor Bachman, for inviting me. I'm from San Diego. Last night, I was at a program on whistleblowers, also at AU, and I opened my BlackBerry, I still have an old-fashioned BlackBerry, and saw that France News was reporting that the United States is bombing Syria, which is no surprise, because President Obama gave a speech, I think it was a week or two ago, basically escalating the drone war that he has been conducting for the past 5.5 years by declaring his intention to degrade and ultimately destroy the Islamic State, which is also known as ISIS or ISIL. Since August the 8th, Obama has mounted at least 154 airstrikes in Iraq, and that number is probably now out of date. He will send an additional 475 U.S. troops, increasing the total number in Iraq to about 1,600. Of course, no boots on the ground, just 1,600. I don't know what they're wearing, but evidently not boots. Obama announced that he would conduct a systematic campaign of airstrikes in Iraq and possibly in Syria, and of course that possibility has now become a reality. But not limiting himself to those countries, Obama declared the whole world his battlefield, stating, "We will hunt down terrorists who threaten our country wherever they are. If you threaten America, you will find no safe haven." Now, if indeed there were an imminent threat of attack on the United States, then Obama would legally be entitled to launch a military operation. The United Nations Charter, which prohibits the use of military force, allows an exception when a country acts in self-defense. And when the United States ratifies a treaty like the UN Charter, the obligations in that treaty become part of U.S. law under the Supremacy Clause of the Constitution, which says treaties shall be the supreme law of the land. So we are bound by the United Nations Charter, notwithstanding many statements that come out of our government that nobody's going to tell us what to do. We signed on to the UN Charter. We became a party to the UN Charter. The UN Charter was part of the United Nations organization that was formed in 1945 by the countries of the world after millions of people had lost their lives in World Wars I and II, and the preamble to the UN Charter states that it is dedicated to saving succeeding generations from the scourge of war. Now, under the well-established Caroline Doctrine, the necessity for self-defense must be instant, overwhelming, leaving no choice of means and no moment for deliberation. The only problem is, Obama admitted we have not yet detected specific plotting against our homeland. Citing only the vague possibility of future deadly attacks, Obama nevertheless declared a perpetual war with no specific end time. The only other exception to the UN Charter's prohibition on the use of military force is when the Security Council has given its approval. Obama is going to chair a meeting of the Security Council to what he said, mobilize the international community. But the Charter requires that the Security Council countenance the military operation before it occurs. And the proposed resolution that the Council is slated to adopt will reportedly call on countries to criminalize recruitment and travel of foreign fighters that join extremist military forces, and require the sharing of airline passenger information. It will not, however, authorize the use of military force. Obama's war violates the UN Charter, and, as I said, it is a ratified treaty and part of U.S. law. Obama's war also violates the War Powers Resolution, which permits the president to introduce U.S. armed forces into hostilities or imminent hostilities only in 3 situations. First, after Congress has declared war, which has not happened in this case. The Constitution gives Congress, not the president, the power to declare war. Second, the War Powers Resolution permits the president to authorize U.S. armed forces into hostilities or imminent hostilities in a national emergency created by an attack upon the United States, its territories or possessions, or its armed forces, which again has not occurred. The third instance where the president can introduce U.S. forces into hostilities is when there is a specific statutory authorization. But Obama has not asked Congress to authorize his military attacks. Indeed, Obama declared in his speech, "I have the authority to address the threat from ISIL." He was relying on the authorization for the use of military force, or AUMF, that Congress passed in 2001, which President George W. Bush used to invade Afghanistan. I'm going to talk about Afghanistan a little bit later. But the AUMF only authorized force against individuals, groups, and countries that had planned, authorized, committed, or aided the 9/11 terrorist attacks. ISIS did not even exist in 2001. In fact, Ayman al-Zawahiri, al-Qaeda's leader, formally kicked ISIS out of al-Qaeda earlier this year. When it passed the 2001 AUMF, Congress specifically rejected the Bush administration's request for open-ended military authority to deter and preempt any future acts of terrorism or aggression against the United States. Moreover, in the National Defense Authorization Act of 2012, Congress specified nothing in this section is intended to expand the authority of the president or the scope of the 2001 AUMF. Apparently, Obama is also relying on the 2002 AUMF Congress passed, which authorized the president to use armed forces as he determines necessary and appropriate to defend the national security of the United States against the continuing threat posed by Iraq and to enforce all relevant UN security resolutions regarding Iraq. But since that threat and those resolutions were aimed at Saddam Hussein's weapons of mass destruction, that license too has ended. Indeed, in June, the White House declared that the 2002 AUMF is no longer used for any U.S. government activities. That means that Obama's current war is not simply a continuation of Bush's Iraq war, and the 2002 AUMF does not provide Obama with legal license to mount his military attacks. The War Powers Resolution requires Obama to secure new congressional authorization for his war within 60 days of launching hostilities, or he must withdraw U.S. forces within 30 days. The 60-day period, which began on August the 8th, runs on October 7th. Obama apparently feels unconstrained to comply with the law. During the 2008 presidential campaign, Obama told the Boston Globe, "The president does not have the power under the Constitution to unilaterally authorize a military attack in a situation that does not involve stopping an actual or imminent threat to the nation." Earlier this year, Obama said, "No country can maintain its freedom in the face of continual war." Yet that is exactly what he is doing with his declaration of perpetual war. Obama is violating both U.S. and international law. He is also risking even more blowback against the United States. The US government has destabilized the region with Bush's Afghan and Iraq wars and Obama's killing of thousands of people with drones. Many Sunnis are less afraid of ISIS than they are of the puppet Shiite government the United States installed in Iraq, which tortured, raped, murdered, and arbitrarily detained Sunnis during the last 2.5 years since US troops pulled out. ISIS is a brutal group, but Obama is imploring Congress to fund, and I think Congress did fund, the Free Syrian Army, which, according to the New York Times, beheaded 6 captives. Playing both ends against the middle, Obama wants to fight ISIS in Syria without emboldening President Bashar Assad, who is also fighting ISIS. And Obama is now bombing Syria, a sovereign country, in defiance of Assad. Obama is playing with fire. Besides being illegal, Obama's war promises to exacerbate the volatile situation in the region, resulting in more hostility against the United States. Obama has said in the past there is no military solution to this conflict. He should use his leadership in the Security Council to secure a ceasefire, create a peacekeeping force, mount an embargo of all arms being sent to the region, pursue a regional diplomatic solution enlisting Iran and Syria in the process, and step up humanitarian aid to Iraq and to Syria. Perpetual war is not the answer. So let's talk for a few minutes about Obama's drone war, which has been going on since he took office. And Professor Bachman said that Chris Woods from the Bureau of Investigative Journalism will be speaking to you later in the week as part of your Human Rights Week. And the Bureau of Investigative Journalism is a British organization, the premier organization that counts civilian casualties. Alice Ross, also from the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, wrote one of the chapters in my collection, which is coming out next month, which Professor Bachman mentioned. It's an interdisciplinary anthology talking about different aspects of drones and targeted killings from legal and moral and political perspectives. Archbishop Desmond Tutu wrote the foreword. There are chapters by policy analysts, human rights activists, sociologists, a philosopher, lawyers, law professors, etc. So, in his 2009 acceptance speech for the Nobel Peace Prize, Obama declared, "Where force is necessary, we have a moral and strategic interest in binding ourselves to certain rules of conduct. And even as we confront a vicious adversary that abides by no rules, I believe the United States of America must remain a standard bearer in the conduct of war." By the time Obama accepted the Nobel Peace Prize, 1 year into his presidency, he had ordered more drone strikes than George W. Bush had authorized during his 2 presidential terms. The Bush administration detained and tortured suspected terrorists. And my last book, as Professor Bachman mentioned, United States in Torture, Interrogation, Incarceration, and Abuse, is also a collection, interdisciplinary collection of essays about Bush's torture regime and also torture in US prisons, especially supermax prisons in this country, and the blowback from torture and how it makes us less safe, not more safe, in addition to the fact that torture doesn't work because the person being tortured will say anything to get the torture to stop. And there is an absolute prohibition on torture. The Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman, or Degrading Treatment or Punishment, another treaty the United States has ratified, making it part of US law, says no exceptional circumstances whatsoever, including a state of war, may ever be used as a justification for torture. That means torture is never allowed, even if it did work, which it doesn't, even if it didn't make us less safe, which it does. Torture is not going on to the same extent during the Obama administration as it did during the Bush administration. Yet Obama continues the practice of force-feeding prisoners at Guantanamo who are engaging in a hunger strike. Many of them have been there for years with no charges, with no hope of ever being released, and their only power is to refuse food. And even though many international treaties, agreements, medical conventions say that no doctor should participate in the force feeding of a prisoner who understands the consequences of refusing food, the Bush administration and now the Obama administration nevertheless force feed prisoners, which is extremely painful. A tube being forced into the nose, down into the stomach, no anesthesia, and during the Bush administration, and I don't know if this is still the same under Obama, no sterilization between uses. So as that tube is coming towards your nose, you can see the blood and the bile of the prior prisoner on it. It's excruciatingly painful. The UN Human Rights Commission declared it to amount to be a form of torture. Now, so the Bush administration detained and tortured suspected terrorists. The Obama administration has chosen to illegally assassinate them, often with the use of drones. And the continued indefinite detention of men at Guantanamo belies Obama's pledge 2 days after his first inauguration to close the prison camp there. However, Obama has added only one detainee to the Guantanamo roster. This government has decided that instead of detaining members of Al-Qaeda at Guantanamo, they are going to kill them, according to John Bellinger, who formulated the Bush administration's drone policy. On Terror Tuesdays, Obama and John Brennan, Obama's former counterterrorism advisor, now CIA director, go through the kill list to identify which individuals should be assassinated that week. The Obama administration has developed a creative method to count casualties, civilian casualties, from these assassinations. All military-age men killed in a drone strike zone are considered to be combatants unless there is explicit intelligence posthumously proving them innocent. That means after they're dead. Brennan falsely claimed in 2011 that no civilians had been killed in drone strikes in nearly a year. Obama orders 2 different kinds of drone attacks: personality strikes that target named high-value terrorists, and signature strikes that target training camps and suspicious compounds in areas controlled by militants. In the signature strikes, sometimes known as crowd killings, the Obama administration often doesn't even know who they're killing. But, according to the New York Times, some State Department officials have complained to the White House that the criteria used by the CIA for identifying a terrorist signature were too lax. The joke was that when the CIA sees 3 guys doing jumping jacks, the agency thinks it's a terrorist training camp, said one senior official. Men loading a truck with fertilizer could be bomb makers, but they might also be farmers, skeptics argued. Before taking the life of a person off the battlefield, the Due Process Clause of the U.S. Constitution requires the government to arrest a suspect, inform him of the charges against him, and provide him with a fair trial. But like his predecessor, Obama defines virtually the entire world as a battlefield, ostensibly obviating the necessity to provide due process before execution. The Bush administration took the position that neither the criminal law nor international humanitarian law, which comes from the Hague and Geneva Conventions and governs the conduct of war, protected the targets of the so-called war on terror. And I say so-called war on terror because terrorism is a tactic. It's not an enemy, and you don't declare war on a tactic. And yet, under the guise of the so-called war on terror, the Bush administration shredded the Constitution, illegally invading 2 countries, torturing suspects, indefinitely detaining people, cutting back on our civil liberties, surveilling people that were assumed to dissent against U.S. policies, and unfortunately, Obama has continued many of those same policies. Thanks to Edward Snowden and Chelsea Manning, we know about the massive surveillance that took place. It took place and continues to take place by the NSA. Now, these targets of the so-called war on terror existed in what was called a legal black hole, and that was a term that was used to describe what was happening at Guantanamo. Obama has apparently adopted the same position, although he has replaced the moniker war on terror with war on al-Qaeda, and I think he's going to have to add ISIS and this new organization and on and on and on. But there is not a distinct, and this is a quote, there is not a distinct entity called al-Qaeda that provides a sound basis for defining and delimiting an authorized use of military force, according to Paul Pillar, a former deputy director of the CIA's Counterterrorism Center. Both the Bush and the Obama administrations have justified their targeted killing policies with reference to the AUMF that I mentioned. And I'll quote it, it says, it authorizes the president to use all necessary and appropriate force against those nations, organizations, or persons he determines planned, authorized, committed, or aided the terrorist attacks that occurred on September 11, 2001, or harbored such organizations or persons in order to prevent any future acts of international terrorism against the United States by such nations, organizations, or persons. As I said, this authorization is limited to groups and countries that supported the 9/11 attacks. And as I also said, Congress rejected the Bush administration's request for open-ended military authority to deter and preempt any future acts of terrorism or aggression against the United States. But deterrence and preemption are exactly what Obama is trying to accomplish by sending robots to kill suspected militants. Obama has extended his battlefield beyond Iraq and Afghanistan to Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, and Libya, even though the United States is not at war with those countries, although now it looks like we are at war once again with Iraq. U.S. drones fly from Allied bases, actually beyond Iraq and Afghanistan, to the other countries with which we're not at war, although Syria, it looks like we're at war with Syria, excuse me. U.S. drones fly from Allied bases in Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Italy, Qatar, the Philippines, and the United Arab Emirates. Expanding into West Africa, the United States has built a major drone hub in Djibouti. Armed drones are operated by pilots located thousands of miles from their targets. Before dropping its payload, the drone hovers above the area. It emits a buzzing sound that terrorizes communities. The drones were terrifying, observed New York Times journalist David Rhodey, who was captured by the Taliban in Afghanistan in 2008 and later escaped. From the ground, it is impossible to determine who or what they are tracking as they circle overhead. The buzz of a distant propeller is a constant reminder of imminent death. Drones fire missiles that travel faster than the speed of sound. A drone's victim never hears the missile that kills him. After the drone drops a bomb on its target, a second strike often bombs the people rescuing the wounded from the first strike. And frequently, a third strike targets mourners at the funerals for those felled by the prior strikes. This is called a double tap, but it's more accurately a triple tap. U.S. drones have killed children, rescuers, funeral processions on multiple occasions, according to a report of the Council on Foreign Relations. Obama's administration has killed at least as many people in targeted killings as died on 9/11. But of the estimated 3,000 people killed by drones, the vast majority were neither al-Qaeda nor Taliban leaders, a Council on Foreign Relations reported. The Council on Foreign Relations reported. Instead, most were low-level, anonymous, suspected militants who were predominantly engaged in insurgent or terrorist operations against their governments rather than in active international terrorist plots. Although more than 95% of all non-battlefield targeted killings have been carried out by drones, the killer robots are not the only medium used to conduct targeted killings. The United States also employs Joint Special Operations Command, or JSOC, to conduct raids, as well as AC-130 gunships and cruise missiles launched offshore by air or sea. Drones are Obama's weapon of choice because, unlike piloted fighter aircraft, they don't jeopardize the lives of U.S. pilots. There are claims that the use of drones results in fewer civilian casualties than manned bombers. However, a study based on classified military data conducted by the Center for Naval Analyses and the Center for Civilians in Conflict found that the use of drones in Afghanistan has caused 10 times more civilian deaths than manned fighter aircraft. In the United States, the dominant narrative about the use of drones in Pakistan is of a surgically precise and effective tool that makes the U.S. safer by enabling the targeted killing of terrorists with minimal downsides or collateral impacts. This narrative is false, according to the comprehensive report, Living Under Drones, issued by Stanford Law School and NYU Law School. Many killed by drones are civilians, or, as the administration says, bug splat. Bug splat. They're talking about civilians being flattened like bugs, referring to the collateral damage estimate methodology the U.S. military and the CIA employ. Targeted killing with drones is counterproductive. General Stanley McChrystal, architect of the U.S. counterinsurgency strategy in Afghanistan, declared that drones are hated on a visceral level and contribute to a perception of American arrogance. Kurt Volker, former U.S. ambassador to NATO, concurs. Drone strikes do not solve our terrorist problem, he noted. In fact, drone use may prolong it. Even though there is no immediate retaliation, in the long run, the contributions to radicalization through drone use may put more American lives at risk. And one of the chapters in my forthcoming book is called Blowback, and it's about this very topic, written by Professor John Quigley from Ohio State University Law School. Mullah Zabara, a southern tribal sheikh from Yemen, told Jeremy Scahill, the U.S. sees al-Qaeda as terrorism, and we can consider the drones terrorism. The drones are flying day and night, frightening women and children, disturbing sleeping people. This is terrorism. The Center for Foreign Relations reported a strong correlation in Yemen between stepped-up targeted killings since December 2009 and heightened anger toward the United States and sympathy with or allegiance to al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. Drone strikes breed increased resentment against the United States and lead to the recruitment of more terrorists. Drones have replaced Guantanamo as the recruiting tool of choice for militants, according to Becker and Shane of the New York Times. And they quoted Faisal Shahzad, who, while pleading guilty to trying to detonate a bomb in Times Square, told the judge, when the drones hit, they don't see children. Pakistani ambassador Zamir Akram said that the drone attacks are illegal and violate the sovereignty of Pakistan, not to mention being counterproductive. Thousands of innocent people, including women and children, have been murdered in these indiscriminate attacks. In May 2013, Chief Justice Dost Mohammad Khan of the High Court of Peshawar in Pakistan ruled that U.S. drone strikes in the region were illegal. The Bush administration's 2002 drone strike in Yemen that killed, among others, U.S. citizen Ahmed Hijazi, also known as Kamal Derwish, was the first publicly confirmed U.S. targeted killing outside a battlefield since President Gerald Ford signed a ban on political assassinations in 1976. It means the rules of engagement have changed, a former CIA official with knowledge about special operations told the Los Angeles Times after the strike in Yemen. That would be the first time that they have started doing this kind of thing. It wouldn't be the last. Scahill writes, the secret war in Pakistan became largely a drone bombing campaign described by CIA officers at the US Embassy in Islamabad as boys with toys. By the end of Obama's first year at the US Embassy in Islamabad, by the end of Obama's first year as president, he and his new counterterrorism team would begin building the infrastructure for a formalized US assassination program. Scahill added, with an aggressive embrace of assassination as a centerpiece of US national security policy. In December 2009, Admiral William McRaven, JSOC commander, authorized JSOC to carry out a series of targeted killings in Yemen. The United States uses two types of armed drones. The Predator, that costs $4.5 million each, and the Reaper, valued at $15 million. Both are produced by General Atomics Aeronautical Systems in San Diego, where I live. The Reaper houses up to 4 Hellfire missiles and 2 500-pound bombs. It can fly to heights of 21,000 feet for up to 22 hours. Its cameras enable the pilots operating the drone 7,500 miles away to see the faces of their targets on the computer screen as the bomb hits. And even though they're not right there, they're many, many thousands of miles away, many drone pilots have reported suffering from PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Tom Dispatch has identified 60 bases used in U.S. drone operations, although there could be more, as there is a cloak of secrecy surrounding our drone warfare program. The drone industry doesn't like to refer to their killer robots as drones because of the negative connotation of these machines droning above communities. They prefer to call them unmanned aerial vehicles or unmanned aerial systems. Targeted killing, which is just the death penalty without due process, Clyde Stafford Smith told The Guardian, is an example of American exceptionalism, reflecting the view that the people in the United States are somehow superior to those in other countries. In his 2013 speech to the UN General Assembly, Obama stated, "Some may disagree, but I believe that America is exceptional, in part because we have shown a willingness through the sacrifice of blood and treasure to stand up not only for our own narrow self-interest, but for the interests of all." But in addition to the U.S. soldiers killed in Iraq and Afghanistan, hundreds of thousands of people in those countries have been killed and untold numbers wounded. And the $4 to $6 trillion we spent on those wars could have been put to much better use in this country. Time columnist Joe Klein, considered by many to be a liberal, bought into American exceptionalism in a disturbing way in a 2012 interview by Joe Scarborough on MSNBC's Morning Joe. Scarborough observed, "You have 4-year-old girls being blown to bits because we have a policy that says, you know what, instead of trying to go in, take the risk, get the terrorists out of hiding, we're just going to blow up everyone around them." And he mentioned collateral damage. Klein retorted, "The bottom line in the end is, whose 4-year-old girl gets killed? What we're doing is limiting the possibility that 4-year-olds here are going to get killed by imminent, indiscriminate acts of terror. So it's preferable that foreign little girls get killed in order to protect American little girls." American exceptionalism also reared its head in February 2013, after the leak of a Department of Justice white paper that described circumstances under which the president could order the targeted killing of U.S. citizens. There had been little public concern in the United States about drone strikes killing people in other countries. But when it was revealed that U.S. citizens might be targeted, Americans were outraged. This was exemplified by Senator Rand Paul's 13-hour filibuster of John Brennan's nomination for CIA director. It is this double standard that motivated Nobel Peace Prize winner Archbishop Desmond Tutu to write a compelling letter to the editor of the New York Times in which he asked, do the United States and its people really want to tell those of us who live in the rest of the world that our lives are not of the same value as yours? And the Archbishop elaborates on that observation in the foreword to my forthcoming anthology. In May 2013, as international criticism targeted Obama's drone policy and the continued indefinite detention at Guantanamo, where detainees were starving themselves to death and military guards were violently force-feeding them, the president delivered a speech. He explained that the United States is at war with Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and their associated forces, without defining who those associated forces are. Although he defended his use of drones and targeted killing, Obama proclaimed, America does not take strikes when we have the ability to capture individual terrorists. Our preference is always to detain, interrogate, and prosecute them. Obama referred to the killing of Osama bin Laden as exceptional because capture, although our preference, was remote. Yet it was clear when the U.S. soldiers arrived at bin Laden's compound that the people there were unarmed and that bin Laden could have been captured. Obama admitted the cost to our relationship with Pakistan and the backlash among the Pakistani public over encroachment on their territory was so severe that we are just now beginning to rebuild this important partnership. In view of Pakistan's considerable arsenal of nuclear weapons, Obama took a substantial risk to our national security in breaching Pakistan's sovereignty by his assassination operation. As Obama delivered his remarks, the White House issued a fact sheet containing policies and procedures for counterterrorism operations, but did not release the full presidential policy guidance on which it was based. The fact sheet says, the policy of the United States is not to use lethal force when it is feasible to capture a terrorist suspect. It provides that lethal force will be used outside areas of active hostilities only when certain preconditions are met, but it does not define areas of active hostilities. A target must pose a continuing, imminent threat to U.S. persons. The fact sheet does not define continuing or imminent. The leaked Department of Justice white paper says that a U.S. citizen can be killed even where there is no clear evidence that a specific attack on U.S. persons and interests will take place in the immediate future. This renders the imminence requirement a nullity. There must be near certainty that the terrorist target is present, that non-combatants will not be injured or killed, and that capture is not feasible, which is also left undefined. A showing must be made that governmental authorities in the target country cannot or will not effectively address the threat to U.S. persons, also left undefined, and no reasonable alternatives exist. A legal basis is required for the use of lethal force, but the fact sheet fails to define that legal basis. Whatever it may involve, it surely violates treaties ratified by the United States, which I said are part of the U.S. law under the Supremacy Clause of the Constitution. And I mentioned the UN Charter, which prohibits the use of force except in military force except in self-defense or when approved by the Security Council. But the fact sheet would excuse these preconditions when the president takes action in extraordinary circumstances, which are both lawful and necessary to protect the United States or its allies. There is no definition of extraordinary circumstances. The month before Obama gave his speech, McClatchy reported that the administration had been misrepresenting the types of groups and individuals it was targeting with drones in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Citing classified U.S. intelligence reports, the McClatchy piece said that contrary to the administration's claims that it had deployed drones only against known senior leaders of al-Qaeda and allied groups, it had in fact targeted and killed hundreds of suspected low-level Afghan, Pakistani, and other militants in scores of strikes in Pakistan. At times, the CIA killed people who were only suspected, associated with, or who probably belonged to militant groups. The Council on Foreign Relations reported that McClatchy's findings indicate the administration is misleading the public about the scope of who can legitimately be targeted. Obama's claim of vast executive power to kill anyone he wants with no judicial involvement is precisely what the Founding Fathers feared when they wrote 3 co-equal branches of government into the Constitution to check and balance each other. It is only Congress that has the power to declare war. Indeed, Georgetown law professor Rosa Brooks testified at a congressional hearing when a government claims for itself the unreviewable power to kill anyone, anywhere on earth, at any time, based on secret criteria and secret information discussed in a secret process by largely unnamed individuals, it undermines the rule of law. Generals involved in the U.S. overseas drone program are being tapped by the Department of Homeland Security to develop and direct our domestic drone program. This is emblematic of the increasing merger of the post-9/11 homeland/security/border security complex with the military-industrial complex, in the words of Tom Berry, a senior policy analyst at the Center for International Policy. The Pentagon is slated to spend $5.78 billion in 2013 for research and procurement of drone systems, and the Department of Homeland Security is spending millions of dollars in contracts with drone manufacturers, including General Atomics. As Congress considers immigration reform, which they're no longer considering, I don't think, especially in light of the impending midterm elections, Senator John McCain observed that the Border Security Economic Opportunity and Immigration Modernization Act, which the Senate passed, would make the U.S.-Mexico border the most militarized border since the fall of the Berlin Wall. This raises troubling issues regarding the morality and wisdom of our national priorities. Another disturbing issue is that the unlawful precedent the United States is setting with its use of killer drones and other forms of targeted killing not only undermines the rule of law, it will also prevent the United States from reasonably objecting when other countries that obtain drone technology develop their kill lists of persons those countries believe represent threats to them. I want to say, before we open it up to Q&A, a few words about the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, both of which violated the UN Charter. Neither one was carried out in self-defense. Neither one was sanctioned by the Security Council, which led to not just the killing of nearly 5,000 Americans, but also tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of Iraqis and Afghanis. Unknown numbers wounded, both there and here, soldiers coming back with PTSD, and completely destabilizing those countries. Saddam Hussein, if he had been receptive to U.S. investment in oil, he would still be there. Just like many dictators are propped up, supported, and financed by the U.S. In fact, this is a historical pattern. In 1953, the CIA engineered a coup and threw out the democratically elected Mohammad Mossadegh in Iran, who had dared to nationalize the British petroleum interests and installed the Shah of Iran. Talk about a terrorist and a tyrant. Vicious for 25 years, torturing people, murdering them, until there was a revolution in 1979 in Iran where they overthrew the Shah and replaced it with a theocracy, which has kind of provided a model for these extremist movements ever since. This is called blowback. The same thing happened in Chile, where the CIA engineered a coup against the democratically elected Salvador Allende and replaced him with the vicious Augusto Pinochet, who was infamous for his torture and murder. Now the United States is, as you know, supporting the government of Bahrain, which is involved in terrible human rights violations against its own people, and the weapons that the United States provides Bahrain with are used to crack down on pro-democracy protesters in Bahrain. And yet not a word about the human rights record in Bahrain from our government. Of course, Bahrain is the seat of the Fifth Fleet. That must have something to do with it. We are also very cozy with the royal family of Saudi Arabia, involved in horrible human rights violations, but one of our key allies in the Middle East, home to, sometimes we say, how did our oil get under their soil? And the list goes on and on and on. So with no connection to 9/11 whatsoever, and with no threat of any invasion by Iraq of any other country, Iraq had not invaded any country for 12 years since Kuwait, Bush, in a bald-faced war of aggression, invaded Iraq because of alleged weapons of mass destruction, even though the weapons inspectors who had been inspecting Iraq for many years said that his weapons that he had at one time, chemical and biological weapons, which the United States knew about. There's a famous picture of Donald Rumsfeld, Bush's defense secretary, shaking hands with Saddam Hussein in 1984 or 1988 when he was gassing the Kurds and the Iranians with poison gas. They had been completely destroyed by the first Gulf War, by the years of punishing sanctions, by Bill Clinton's bombing of Iraq on the eve of his impeachment. And so there was no self-defense. The Security Council never gave its blessing to the invasion of Iraq. And so Bush cobbled together prior Security Council resolutions, which individually or collectively did not authorize the bombing of Iraq, and went in, didn't find any weapons of mass destruction, so the rationale morphed into bringing democracy to the Iraqi people. Well, actually morphed in, yeah, and so they had to remove Saddam Hussein from the throne, give him a kangaroo court trial, kill him, and then install a U.S. puppet, totally destabilizing that country. Regardless of what we think of Saddam Hussein, he was not a nice man, not nice like a lot of the dictators we support. He kept that country together in a very stable way, kept this sectarian fighting from erupting, and now what happened with that destabilization is that it's a disaster. Now, you might think, well, yes, you've convinced me about Iraq, but what about Afghanistan? You know, that was in response to the 9/11 attacks, and almost no one questioned Bush's war on Afghanistan after the 9/11 attacks. We were all in shock. Congress, who had rejected a lot of the items in the Patriot Act before 9/11, gave Bush a 352-page Patriot Act 3 months after 9/11 without even reading it, many of them. Many of them many Senate staffers called the ACLU the next day saying, well, what did our member vote on? They hadn't even read it. And the Patriot Act really lowers the standards for surveillance and makes it much easier for the government to spy on us. So after 9/11, I don't know how many of you remember, but you turn on the TV and they had a color-coded threat level. So today the threat level is just yellow, but today it's orange and it's moving toward red. I don't know how they knew this, right, or what the threat level was, but it was meaningless, but it hyped fear, and it hyped fear in the populace, it hyped fear in the Congress, so the Congress gave Bush the Patriot Act, the authorization to use force in Iraq, the Military Commissions Act, whatever he wanted, the Congress just rolled over. So back to Afghanistan. 9/11 attack, September 11th, 2001. By, I think, the second or third week of October, we were bombing Afghanistan. So let's look at the UN Charter. Was that done in self-defense? Had Afghanistan mounted an armed attack in the United States? Well, actually, those 9/11 hijackers, 15 of them came from Saudi Arabia. Why didn't we bomb Saudi Arabia? We know why. Did any of them come from Afghanistan? No. Were any of them in any way connected with the Taliban? No. This was not done in self-defense. So Bush said, well, we think Osama bin Laden was responsible and you're harboring a terrorist and therefore we can attack you if you don't turn him over. Now, if that gave the US the lawful right to attack Afghanistan, then, hypothetically, in 1979, when the Iranian people overthrew the Shah of Iran and he fled to the United States and got safe haven here, which did happen, but hypothetically, if the new government of Iran had come to President Jimmy Carter and said, turn over the Shah to us, he's a terrorist, he's a tyrant, and if you don't, we will attack you. Would that have given Iran the legal right to come in and attack us? I don't think anybody would say yes. So what about the Security Council? Did the Security Council give its blessing to the invasion of Afghanistan? And the answer is no, it did not. In none of the post-9/11 resolutions, and there were a number about ratifying anti-terrorism conventions, sharing intelligence, etc., nothing about authorizing the invasion of Afghanistan. So that too was an illegal war under the UN Charter. And the blowback has been incredible. The hatred against the United States and of course morphing into this drone war, which makes us even more hated around the world. So there are many other things that I can talk about. I want to stop there and leave some time for questions and answers. Also, I guess just to tie together some of the other themes of the week, I want to say one other thing. And that is that I was just, I'm not going to quite open it up for Q&A yet, just thought of something else. I just came from San Diego where last weekend the U.S. campaign to end the Israeli occupation held their national conference. And one of the speakers at that conference was a 15-year-old boy named Tariq. And you might have seen his picture back in July. After the killing of the 3 Israeli teenagers, Israeli forces killed Tariq's brother Mohammed, burned him to death, actually, and then viciously beat Tariq. You might have seen that picture of his swollen face. You can barely recognize him. And he's an American. Of course, he'd be dead now if he were not an American. He's an American. He had gone with his family to Palestine, where his relatives were. They were going to spend 6 weeks and visit their relatives for summer vacation. He was playing with his friends. He and Mohammed were like that, another 15-year-old. And because of the anger against Arabs, and particularly Palestinians, after the killing of these 3 Israeli teenagers, the police ran after them, killed Mohammed, beat Tariq, and incarcerated many more of these kids. Are still in custody with no charges. And so I was looking, and the other thing that happened was that during those, I believe it was 6 or 7 weeks, over 2,100 Palestinians, mostly civilians, 80 to 85% of them civilians, over 500 of them children, were killed. More than 10,000 people were wounded. Tens of thousands, about 60,000 people lost their homes. The infrastructure was devastated. And what was bombed? Military targets, schools, hospitals, mosques, ambulances, doctors who were treating the wounded in violation of international law. Meanwhile, the United States was arming the Israeli government, providing ammunition, the Iron Dome missile defense, and you might say, well, that was defensive, but they were not providing defensive weapons to the Palestinians as well. And I think 60-some Israelis were killed from from the rockets that the Palestinians were throwing at them. Just devastating. So I went and looked at the Rome Statute for the International Criminal Court and looked under specific war crimes, crimes against humanity, and even genocide, and wrote an article with documenting information from what I had been able to research that would support an investigation. An International Criminal Court is a criminal tribunal, and it doesn't try countries, it tries individual leaders and commanders for these most serious offenses: genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity. It also has a provision to try individuals who have aided and abetted those crimes by providing the means to commit those crimes. So I documented certain war crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity. Genocide is the intent to destroy in whole or in part a specific group based on its ethnic, racial, religious character, etc. So this became the basis for a letter that my organization, the National Lawyers Guild, the Center for Constitutional Rights in New York, the International Association of Democratic Lawyers, the Association of American Lawyers, and the Arab Lawyers Union sent to the ICC prosecutor, asking her to investigate these individuals for these crimes. Now, she has said, let me just back up, neither Israel nor the United States has ratified the Rome Statute for the International Criminal Court. But if any individuals from Israel or the United States have committed crimes on the territory of a party to the ICC statute, then they can be prosecuted, investigated and prosecuted. So the question, is Palestine a member of the ICC? Well, Palestine, back in 2009, when it filed a declaration acceding to the statute, at that point it didn't have state status. In the meantime, the General Assembly, over the vehement objections of Israel and the United States, because they didn't want to become defendants in war crimes prosecutions, gave Palestine non-state observer status. So now the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court is saying that if Palestine files a new declaration accepting the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court, that she could take jurisdiction. And only leaders who have come before the International Criminal Court since it came into effect in 2002 are African leaders. But she said, I'm not going to be political about this, but the ball is in Palestine's court. So Hamas, whose leaders also are vulnerable to prosecution for war crimes, for throwing the rockets, etc., which could not distinguish between civilians, and that's one of the war crimes, said, yes, let's sign on to the statute. But Mahmoud Abbas, so Hamas is in charge of Gaza, Mahmoud Abbas and the Palestinian Authority are in charge of the West Bank, and Mahmoud Abbas is dragging his feet and not deciding whether or not to sign on to the International Criminal Court statute. He stands to lose a lot of money from Israel. There's a lot of pressure from the United States. So it's still now in flux. But the real problem there is the maintenance of an illegal and vicious occupation of Gaza and a blockade, a siege, where, and the basis for the genocide charge is that while Israel's bombing the Palestinians, Israel ropes off, doesn't let them leave. So they're caged there. So Israel is implicitly intending to wipe out a bunch of them because they won't let them leave. In fact, Israel even bombed some UN-run schools, which are supposed to be refuges. Israel supposedly gave people warning and then immediately bombed without giving them time to escape. So where do we come in? Well, if it were not for the United States providing $3.1 billion in military aid to Israel every year, and turning the other way as Israel continues to commit human rights violations, building Jewish settlements illegally on Palestinian land, building that barrier wall encroaching on Palestinian territory, which the International Court of Justice, the World Court, ruled was illegal 10 years ago, continuing to keep Palestinians from leaving Gaza, keep fishermen from going more than 5 miles out to fish, just cutting off their means of subsistence. If the United States did not back that up and support it, they could not be committing those human rights violations. So, I think I've talked long enough. I'm going to stop now, and let's have a discussion.
So we'll, I have to wait, but there we go. Lauren and I have mics, so we'll sort of be passing mics, but also sort of moderating as well. Make sure, comments, questions are respectful and that you keep it brief so that everyone has a chance to be heard. Just a couple things I was just going to add on. If you're interested in the inspections into Iraq before the invasion in 2003, Hoflix has a book out. He was one of the weapons inspectors, and he says flatly, straight out, that there were no weapons to be found. So the official teams that were in there were not listened to. Their investigations were disregarded. Marjorie mentioned a number of things related to drones. In Pakistan, by the Bureau of Investigative Journalism's numbers, which have been confirmed by a second study by the Columbia Law School into civilian casualties, the numbers come out to, for every 4 militants, 1 civilian is killed. And of course, these are militants by definition by military age, which is another thing. When questioned about the counting method, they did not challenge that all military age males were counted as militants. They simply said, we don't intentionally target all military age males. They didn't say anything about those who have been killed and how they count them. So they did not deny that was in fact part of the counting methodology. One last thing I'll just note, and this may come up again on Thursday, but the attack on funerals. The first attack on a funeral happened when a mid-level militant, Taliban Pakistan, was killed intentionally to get a higher level militant to go to the funeral so then they could attack the higher level Taliban leader there. So they intentionally created a place where civilians were known to be congregating just so they could then try and kill this higher level militant. If that's not intentionally targeting civilians, I don't really know what is, other than if there's only civilians there. So just some points I wanted to make. So the last thing I just wanted to sort of get us started here and say, we have right now, we're supporting, a coup in Honduras where there's terrible human rights violations. There's from the coup in Ukraine, Egypt, we support Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, and you could just go on and on, Paul Kagame in Rwanda. Why do you think there's not more dissent related to U.S. foreign policy and human rights? Why is it, I think, a somewhat muted group?
Well, in order to, and you're correct in what you said, in order to really understand what the United States is doing, you can't just open up the New York Times or turn on MSNBC or CNN, because they are, by and large, going to give you the party line. They're going to give you the administration's line. And a lot of Americans supported the Afghan war, the Iraq war, and now this war against ISIS because of the hype from the corporate media, until, as time goes on and they see the situation and how people are being killed and tortured during the Bush administration, and the blowback, and then they oppose it. But in order to really find out what's happening, you've got to dig. You've got to go online. You have to go to alternative media. It's not as easy. It's not as accessible as information that is just readily available through the corporate media. Also, the massive surveillance program that Edward Snowden revealed, every single one of our communications, our electronic communications, our telephone calls are being collected. It's called metadata. It's all being collected, and even though they say they're not reading the content of it, it turns out that they are reading the content of it. But even if they weren't, and even if they were just looking at what websites you visit, that can be very, very incriminating and embarrassing if you visit a gay website, if you visit website of an abortion clinic that does abortions. If you visit WebMD/depression, that tells a lot of personal information about you. And so the purpose of this surveillance, this massive surveillance, is not just to get at the bad guys, but very much like the COINTELPRO, the counterintelligence program during the Nixon administration, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. It's aimed at dissidents. It's aimed at people who dissent against military policies. In fact, Martin Luther King Jr. was targeted by COINTELPRO. They tried to drive him to divorce and suicide, especially after he came out against the Vietnam War. It was very, very threatening to the powers that be. And so surveillance is not just aimed at the bad guys, it's also aimed to stifle dissent. And people feel intimidated. They feel, and they're afraid. And I think that also is another reason why there is not more dissent. I'm a product of the anti-Vietnam War movement, and it was massive. It was just massive. Now, the draft had a lot to do with that. When middle-class kids are getting killed, then people go into the streets. Before Bush invaded Iraq in February of 2003, there was a short period of time where there were at one point 11 million people in the streets all over the world, including in the United States. But because of this intimidation, because of the 24/7 cable cycle where just pounding into your head over and over and over, how correct the administration is, it takes some work to really figure out what's going on. You have to take classes like Professor Bachman's, you have to read books that people like I write, alternative media, radio stations, websites, etc. It's not that accessible.
Hi, I have a question relating to, you spoke a little bit about the terrorists that were arrested for Afghanistan and how they were all Saudi Arabian. I read an article last week.
No, excuse me, the 9/11 hijackers
Right.
who all died.
Right.
They weren't arrested.
Sorry,
15 of them died.
Worded that
Yeah,
wrong.
yeah, I just want to make sure that.
No, you're right. So I read an article last week by Professor Michael Chosadovsky.
Chosadovsky.
Okay.
Yeah.
And apparently there's a couple other out there, like it, but you spoke a little bit about the military coups and how the U.S. was involved with that a lot in Latin America and whatnot. So there's this idea that America created ISIS and is funding this to take over this new world power and whatnot. Do you have any opinions on that?
Yeah, I know Michelle Chosadovsky.
Okay.
He's a friend. He runs the Global Research website. I don't go quite that far. I don't think that the U.S. intentionally created ISIS so that we could then go in with our firepower. But I think indirectly we certainly did, because if it were not for us destabilizing Iraq, supporting Nouri al-Maliki, who did this vicious crackdown on the Sunnis now feel like ISIS could not be worse than U.S. bombs and the Iraqi government. So I think indirectly, ISIS did not exist before we went in and changed the regime and kicked out Saddam Hussein. So in that sense, we indirectly created ISIS. There was also no Al-Qaeda in Iraq before Bush went into Iraq. Then again, the region became very destabilized. But I don't subscribe to a conspiracy theory that we intentionally did that.
Do you see any type of silver lining or way in which positive developments can come from the current developments in the Middle East? Is there any realistic possibility of U.S. involvement being scaled back, of laws being respected, or is this kind of like a dam that's been broken down and there's no way that future U.S. presidents or future Congresses are going to respect international law more so than they have within the last 14 years, 15 years?
Yes, I wish I could say I'm optimistic, but I am not. I think that that a lot of whatever progress is made is going to have to, I mean, first of all, we should get out of there. This is not our struggle. It's true that we've made a mess out of it, but by bombing, that makes it only worse. And, at some point, people need to be able to control their own destiny. And we saw the Arab Spring, which looked very promising and did not go in a very promising direction, especially in Egypt, etc. So I am not terribly optimistic, but I think that our responsibility as citizens in a democracy is to speak out in dissent when our government is doing things in our name that are atrocious. And also spending our money, there is a healthcare, education, infrastructure crisis, housing crisis in this country, a lot of homeless people, and so many places where this money could be used instead of spending more and more on bombs, that if the people in this country really organized and stood up to the government and said, no, we do not agree with those priorities, and also put pressure on our congressional representatives who do respond to pressure. It's our obligation to do that, to write, email, speak out, demonstrate, to the White House, to Congress, anywhere we can, even on the local level, and to talk about the law, talk about those treaties, which are, when we ratify a treaty, those treaty provisions apply at every level of government, not just the federal government, federal, state, local, municipal. And when the United States ratifies a treaty, we have only ratified 3 human rights treaties. We've ratified the Race Convention, the Torture Convention, and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Which ones haven't we ratified? The Women's Convention, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, Convention on the Disabled, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. But when we do ratify a treaty, we take on the obligation to report to the treaty, the body that administers the treaty, about our progress under the treaty. And the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, which is the body that oversees the compliance of parties like the United States to the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, on August 29th came out with a scathing report about the United States, about racism in the United States. It was just scathing in every area where the United States, different levels of government, are not combating racism where we should be. And so also, when the United States ratifies a treaty, the United States promises to publicize the terms of the treaty. And yet, how many of you have ever heard of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, well, that's more than usual. Probably because of your class. Probably because of your class. But how many of you could say what the terms are of that treaty? Or the Convention Against Torture? Or the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination? So our government is in violation of those treaty obligations by not publicizing, not just by not abiding by the obligations of the treaty, but by not publicizing. So there's a lot that we can do. Letters to the editor, very effective, easy to get published. 150 words or less, you peg it to an editorial or a news article, and even if yours doesn't get published, the editors will look at how many letters there are from a certain viewpoint and then publish representative numbers of letters, so you can actually help other people's letters get published. Call in when on radio shows. There are a lot of participatory things we can do. If you see a demonstration against climate change, join it. And so there are some things I don't want to just paint a doom and gloom, but I do think in terms of the American involvement in making things worse in the world, it's up to the people to stop our government from doing this in our name.
Thanks for coming, and thank you, Professor Bachman, for organizing this. I wish more of the campus was here to participate. What role do you see lobbying by the military-industrial complex, the role of money in politics, corporate influence in Congress? What role does that play in our foreign policy, and how does it constrict the choices available to the president and maybe tie that to the global neoliberalism, if you will.
Yeah, Citizens United, which is probably one of the worst Supreme Court decisions ever to come down, allows unlimited money in politics, which basically means that the richest people, who are generally the most conservative, are going to have the most influence over who gets elected, and the more right-wingers that get elected, the more militaristic our foreign policy is going to be. But I can't just blame the right-wingers, the conservatives, the Republicans, because we see Clinton, we see Obama, and Hillary Clinton looks like she's coming down the pike. She's even more hawkish than Obama is in terms of feeding into the whole neoconservative strategy to continue to be the dominant player in the world. And this is part of the American exceptionalism. We have something like 800 US bases in foreign countries all over the world, from which we can launch attacks, which we can use to control the area. That plus the money that we give through the National Endowment for Democracy in Latin America, through foreign aid, which comes with strings attached. And that is that you go along with our program and follow our particular national policies and priorities, or you lose that money. So I see that only increasing. But I can't just blame it on the Republicans, because Clinton during the 90s, the liberal, right, the Democrat, I don't want to say liberal, but the Democrat, basically spurred the UN to pass punishing sanctions against Iraq, which killed 1 million Iraqis, half of them children. They took, devastated their infrastructure, and bombed Kosovo in a so-called humanitarian intervention, even though the night before the Kosovo bombing, US-led NATO Kosovo bombing, Clinton said, we have to be able to sell our products to markets all over the world. That's what this Kosovo thing is all about. He admitted that that's what it was about. And then Obama, and we've been talking about what Obama is doing. And so, after 9/11, I was really puzzled by why 19 men would commit suicide and take 3,000 innocent people with them. What is it that they hated so much about the United States? And we were told they hate our democracy. Well, if they hate our democracy, why didn't they go after the Statue of Liberty? Why did they hit the World Trade Center and the Pentagon? So I decided to do a little research. So I researched, and at that point I thought Osama bin Laden was involved in it. So I read what he had written. And I am no fan of Osama bin Laden's, believe me. But there were 3 things that Osama bin Laden that really, really irked him. First of all, was the presence of what he called the foreign infidels, US troops, in the Holy Land, Mecca and Medina in Saudi Arabia. And after Bush took over Iraq, he pulled those troops out and put them in Iraq. Second were the sanctions against the Iraqi people during the Clinton administration that he cited as having killed all these Iraqis, half of them children. And the third thing that really, really upset Osama bin Laden was Israel's occupation of the Palestinian lands. And so what do we learn from this? Well, we learned that what makes us less safe and what really destabilizes the world is, what it really comes down to is US foreign policy, is these illegal wars where we go in and kill people, we occupy their lands, we support other governments that illegally occupy other lands, and then we indefinitely detain people, we torture them, and the torture program I barely even talked about was massive. It was a massive program of torture. In fact, we are on the cusp, right on the precipice, I guess, of seeing the release of the U.S. Senate Intelligence Committee's report on torture during the Bush administration. They're redacting out, which means editing out, blacking out a lot of it. But they're so worried about it that they're already doing damage control. And you might recall Obama saying publicly, we tortured some folks. we tortured some folks as if, yeah, you know, and some folks went down to the golf course and some folks. We tortured some folks, admitting that we engaged in a program of torture. Now, we're not gonna see that report until after the midterm elections. We're not gonna see anything until after the midterm elections because it's so political. But when that report comes out, pay attention to it, because it is really, really significant. And when the Abu Ghraib photographs came out, shock waves reverberated around the world. And talk about blowback. When people in other countries see their countrymen being tortured, that makes them hate us even more, not less. That makes them want to do us even more harm. When bombs are dropping on their country, drones are dropping on their country, and this is happening all over that region now. And now, of course, Obama has really escalated this war. That is going to make us less safe, not more safe, and it's going to destabilize that region and the world increasingly.
Hello.
Operation Iraqi Freedom helped overthrow one of the most villainous dictators of our time, who tortured, bombed, gassed, and murdered his own citizens. He also led an entire generation of Iraqi men and boys to their deaths in the Iran-Iraq War. Bearing this in mind, do you believe that the U.S.-led coalition was justified in invading?
No. First of all, it was illegal. And secondly, it has totally destabilized the region and resulted in more bloodshed and killing and disaster than had happened when he was in charge. You're right, he was not a nice person, but neither are many of the dictators that we're supporting all over the world. And so it's, you know, there's just no scenario under which Bush's unjustified, illegal, and immoral war on Iraq in 2003 and subsequently can be justified.
Just to note also, I mean, going to the Iraq-Iran war, we were arming and supporting Saddam Hussein at this time, so that's another, I mean, not that necessarily, just, you know, decides what is appropriate or inappropriate. I mean, Marjorie's already outlined why the Iraq war in 2003 is illegal, but it should be kept in mind that we were supporting Hussein at the time of some of this.
We were also supporting Iran. We were playing both ends against the middle. We were arming both sides to keep them both off balance, to keep them both unstable, so that neither one would be powerful in that area where all our oil was hiding under their soil.
That's essentially what I was going to say, that in answer to your question, that we actually are behind all of this turmoil. That you would think, you know, Saddam Hussein, since the age of 18, was a CIA paid, I mean, whether you want to call him agent or not, but he was trained by the CIA. Most of the people who become dictators in their homelands are either trained in the School of the Americas or by the CIA, are developed by our intelligence agencies and are groomed in those positions. So we have 50-year-long plans for many countries throughout the world. It's a very convoluted, systematic way of conducting foreign policy. It's not as simple as I'm afraid you put it, that we just drop bombs and we create wars. We actually have long-term plans to undermine millions of people's lives.
You're right, and in fact, we also, the CIA trained Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan when he was there fighting with the Mujahideen and on the US side to kick out the Soviets. ISIS, again, grew up because of what the United States did in Iraq. You mentioned the School of the Americas, and there's a chapter in my torture book about the School of the Americas, which was originally in Panama and now is in Fort Benning, Georgia, and they've renamed it because there's so much bad connotation to the name School of the Americas. They've renamed it WINSAC. But at the School of the Americas, the CIA had manuals on torture, and at the School of the Americas, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, probably thousands of military dictators and vicious leaders from Latin American countries, mainly, were trained in torture techniques so that they could pacify their own people and keep and stifle dissent, because the United States was fighting the Cold War, and we didn't want communists to come to power. So in the 70s and the 80s, nearly every single country in Latin America was controlled by a vicious military dictatorship. People were disappeared, they were kidnapped, they were tortured, they were murdered, and the United States was funding those particular governments and also training their leaders in how to commit torture. And that's something that a lot of people don't know, so I'm glad you brought that up. Thank you.
Hi, I know that specific to Guatemala, we have a lot of policies that are saying that we can't specifically hand, like, the army or the government any helicopters or military equipment, but we give them to the police so that they wind up in the army's hands anyways. What do you think would be an appropriate manner for us as citizens to react to that so that we can see some change in our policies?
Well, one of the things that we could do is make connections between the military and the police. One thing that happened a lot at this conference where I was last weekend were connections between U.S. weapons being used in Gaza and U.S. weapons being used by the police in Ferguson. There is a lot of interplay there. And also in the torture book, I talk about how many of the people who were in charge of the torture in Iraq had been in charge of U.S. prisons and had, been vicious and actually let go, and then they sent them over to Iraq to engage in torture over there. So there's a lot of cross-fertilization, and the United States is one of the leading weapons providers in the world, and we are providing weapons to a lot of these countries so that they can, more effectively suppress their people. Repress, I should say.
Hi, I actually had a question back. You had mentioned Bahrain, and just in general, Jeff's question, also Professor Bachman's question about how can we, since the United States does have its own human rights problems, how can it be a credible sort of influence on other countries that are engaging in human rights violations as someone to say, hey, stop that? When they're kind of doing the same thing.
That's a good question. I can't remember the exact year, but it was when George H.W. Bush went to China, and the Chinese, and started criticizing the Chinese for their human rights record, and the Chinese said, well, then why, if the U.S. is criticizing us for our human rights record, why aren't you ratifying the human rights treaties? And that's when George H.W. Bush went back and sent the Race Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, to the Senate for ratification because of that hypocrisy. And so, yes, it's incredible hypocrisy. Obama is, I have to say, and I'm critical of Obama, and that is not to say that I prefer that a Republican had been elected instead. But I was joyful. I think that everyone was, a lot of people anyway, were, well, not everyone, but when he was elected, I came to Washington. I was at the first inauguration. It was just, it was an electrical atmosphere. He is a magnificent candidate. He's a magnificent orator. His words are really, when he's not talking about American exceptionalism, which is offensive, but he's, very idealistic. He's got a gift of oratory, but he acts in the same way that his predecessors have, both Democratic and Republican. And I'm not talking about domestically quite so much. Obamacare, although it's certainly not single payer, it has resulted in many, many more people having health care coverage than before, and I think he should be given credit for that. But in terms of foreign policy, regardless of, and a lot of people especially in the mainstream media, the corporate media, speculate on, well, and Obama, was he reluctant? Was he convinced by the military, brass that he should go in and he really didn't want to do it? It doesn't really matter. The point is that he ends up doing it the same way that any other president would end up doing. I think we're going to see even more of that from Hillary. Basically proving her military chops. She was talking about obliterating Iran during the campaign. It's just astounding to make that kind of a statement. So no, I think we really don't have standing, if I can use a legal term, to criticize other countries for their human rights violation when we are one of the leading human rights violators in the world.
Maybe I'll ask a final question, maybe it will provide a transition too. So we're going to have after Marjorie answers, we're going to have a brief presentation on the situation in Bahrain, and also there are connections of American University to the monarchy in Bahrain, which I'm sure will be noted during that time. But, I guess one other thing I'll just say, Jimmy Carter did write an op-ed, maybe between a year and 2 years ago, in the New York Times about that the United States has no more moral authority anymore to criticize other countries because of the drones, indefinite detention, illegal invasion of Iraq, etc. I guess the question is, what can we do? I guess let me say two questions. One, what role does and should scholarship play or the academy play? And that may include how certain universities get research grants to do research into things that ultimately will have their end up in the hands of the Pentagon or the Defense Department, promoting the status quo, and then what role do students and what role can faculty and staff have in sort of challenging the current policies in U.S. foreign policy?
Yeah, that's a good question. I do a lot of scholarship. I write books, law review articles, and then a lot of shorter pieces. I read a monthly column for True Thought called Human Rights and Global Wrongs, and sometimes those things get picked up, and not just mine but other people's as well, and become useful, such as the thing about the Israeli leaders in the International Criminal Court. But vis-a-vis Israel, there is a real attack now on faculty at public universities who say or write anything critical of Israel. Stephen Salaita is a good example, where he quit another job because he was offered a job at University of Illinois Champaign-Urbana, and then he tweeted some things that were critical of Israel and the recent Gaza massacre, and they rescinded his job offer, and he now has, his wife quit her job, and he's now jobless with a young child. And people like Alan Dershowitz from Harvard are really behind this whole push to stifle any criticism of Israel, especially in public universities. And that goes not just for speaking critically of Israel, but also writing critically of Israel. And so we can expect increasing repression. But students and faculty both can, I think, and I'm not talking specifically about Israel, but in general, write about things that you see are unjust. And it is not that hard to do. If you look at some progressive websites, and I'm sure that Professor Bachman can turn you on to them if you're not already. Democracy Now!, Amy Goodman, you get every day, which is terrific. And write these letters to the editor, write op-eds, write papers for your classes, which could then be shared and published in some of these areas and really become useful. And also organize together. I mean, when you see an injustice, I'm sure that there are organizations on campus, human rights organizations, that you can organize, even if it's a small protest. This is a town where there's a lot of media, where there is a very, of course, it's the seat of government, and so you can get media attention. Call a press conference, The National Press Club is a place where, for example, the Institute for Public Accuracy, that's something that's a name you should know. The Institute for Public Accuracy puts out press releases frequently, sometimes daily, about things that are happening with links to articles and people who can be who are out in the media. So I think the most important thing is to continue to educate ourselves about what's really happening, and that means digging deep, not just seeing what the corporate media is feeding us, and then writing about it, getting into discussion groups with your peers about it, seminars, and speaking out and organizing wherever you can. And that's the only way things are going to change.
Thank you, Marjorie.
So step one, we're going to write a letter to the president. We'll be emailing that around, and we'll be back here on the 2nd with the sign-up sheets where you can write this, addressing this issue because Bahrain uses these weapons either directly or indirectly towards their people. Step two, we're going to be doing a social media campaign. Like I mentioned, in Bahrain right now, if you go on your social media website, most likely you'll be arrested and detained without due process, and most likely tortured or killed or extended for ridiculous sentences. So the social media campaign is going to be on October 2nd, which is International Day of Nonviolence. We're going to hashtag Bahrain, end abuse, end arms sales, end impunity, and then we're going to hashtag US, UK, and Denmark. Denmark is also a key player in this. I'm sure a lot of you have heard Mariam Al-Khawaja was recently arrested, which she kind of knew she would go over there and basically to stand out to protest against this. She was recently released, but Denmark hasn't really done a lot. She's a Denmark citizen as well as Bahrain citizen, and just hasn't really done a lot in honor of her.
And also, as Valerie said, we're going to be here in the atrium on October 2nd. So we're going to have a presentation, and we're going to have the letters that we're going to send to the presidents later on to be signed. So we hope you can all be there to support us.
And absolutely, and highlight it on your social media as well. We're all doing it on our own personal social medias, and you're welcome to tweet at social activists to get them involved as well. It's really easy, but the main thing is to do it on October 2nd. That way it sees a lot more international attention for a widespread campaign to hopefully stop this.
Please say something about AU's connection with the royal family of Bahrain.
Oh,
or if
yeah, absolutely. Actually, we were just informed, so I should say that the Bahrain is the leader right now for covering up their human rights abuses. They spend, on a world level, the most to cover up their human rights abuses. So for instance,
Yes, please.
okay, so this building actually is founded by the Kingdom of Bahrain. So there's like one good example of ways to cover up their human rights abuses. If you look at, you can go to their website, I believe it's BCH, don't quote me on that. If you look up the Kingdom of Bahrain, they do daily articles on it. But they consistently post articles and spend money to say they're doing this in human rights and they've made progress in this, but yet they continuously detain and torture their people.
Just a quick
That
thing, I
cover-
mean, it's funded, not founded. I mean,
Oh, sorry,
it's-
funded, yes.
The atrium is named after the Crown Prince of Bahrain, who donated $3 million to the building, or to the construction of this building. But also a note, I mean, there's Western PR firms that are paid lots and lots of money to create narratives for the Bahraini monarchy that counter any of the criticism that's thrown at it.
Right, right.
He's
And they
an
actually
AU
created-
grad too.
Sorry?
He's an AU grad too,
Yes.
92.
that's the donation.
Okay.
The Crown Prince is he's an AU wonk.
Oh.
He went
They've-
too far.
They've also created, it's called BC, it's the Bahraini International Commission for Inquiry, to go in, the Crown Prince ordered it to go in and look up the abuses since the Arab Spring in 2011, and they've come up with some interesting statistics. They've documented some, but not all of the human rights abuses, and ADHRB highlighted it more here, but they claim basically to have addressed a lot more issues than they have in the report, so very interesting. Does that answer your question?
We actually have a backgrounder on what the situation is.
Yeah, there's a lot of papers over on the table to look at too.
And ADHRB has brought signs that are over here. If anybody is interested, I have a camera. We can take a picture with you holding the signs in front of the prince's name out here, and we can tweet at ADHRB and at their organization to just kind of get some awareness going if anyone is interested. That's there also.
And because you guys mentioned this, sorry, I stepped out, the October 2nd social media campaign.
Yeah.
Okay, so we figured, so we're, with this new foreign policy co-op, we were thinking about trying to have a more in-your-face action, but I mean, we think this is a good one, and we also want to sort of ease into our direct action. So this is a great campaign. You know, I try to make sure that the connection that AU has is known without going too far. But I think it's an important one, and I think that this kind of social media campaign is good to draw attention to Bahrain, but also let the university know that students are aware of this connection and that it's something that concerns them.
There's a half sheet on all of your seats on that note. The U.S. Foreign Policy Activist Co-op, October 10th. Is that it?
October 2nd.
Oh,
A
2nd.
week from tomorrow?
Yeah, so
Or
it'll be the
today's
first,
Tuesday, week from Thursday.
the first town hall meeting. If y'all want to get involved in more direct action, not just lectures, but actually find a way to be active on campus and in DC, that's what we're trying